Welcome to the debate. Today we're digging into a really foundational shift in American government, the 17th Amendment. This amendment, ratified back in 1913, it fundamentally changed how we choose U.S. senators. It mandated direct popular election, taking that power away from the state legislatures.
Right, and the core question, the real nub of the debate, is this. Did that shift, fatally undermine the balance of American federalism? Did it remove the state's own institutional voice in Washington? Or was it actually a necessary, maybe even overdue democratic reform? Something needed to fix, frankly, a system plagued by corruption and gridlock.
And I'll be arguing that the 17th Amendment did inflict, yes, significant structural damage. It removed what I see as the state's essential vertical check on national power. And that really upset the original constitutional balance.
And I see it differently. I absolutely agree the structural impact is, well, immense. But the history tells us the original system, whatever its theoretical merits, had become, let's be honest, pretty unsavory, unworkable, and frankly, ineffective by the early 1900s. So, for me, the amendment was a vital democratic correction. It was needed to fight rampant corruption and the legislative deadlocks that were just crippling governance.
Okay, so my position starts with the framers. They were, I think, meticulous in building the system of dual sovereignty. They knew that just having horizontal checks, the three federal branches watching each other, wasn't quite enough. They specifically intended the Senate, precisely because state legislatures chose its members, to be this essential second vertical check. The original design, it was really based on the idea that this specific mode of election would compel senators to, constantly, as Alexander Hamilton put it, look up to the state governments with an eye of dependence. This system basically forced them to preserve the federal structure, protect the unique interests of their states as political entities. And this was a critical safeguard against federal overreach. Think about things like unfunded mandates, or the federal government creeping into areas traditionally handled by the states. And beyond that, we lost something fundamental about the Senate itself. Indirect election was meant to foster deliberation, to refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body. The idea was to ensure wisdom, a certain coolness in the Senate's work, which was meant to contrast with the more, shall we say, populist House. Now, when you put the 17th Amendment together with the 16th, the Income Tax Amendment, the consequences become, I think, starkly clear. The federal government got this immense power to tax, and at the same time, the states lost their main institutional check. That's a major shift in power, and I argue it was deeply detrimental to state sovereignty.
Okay, that's a very powerful case for the theory, the vertical check idea, and I don't disagree that on paper, the framers' design had a certain structural elegance. But the historical practice? Well, that demanded reform. The system of indirect election, it was just plagued by chronic, grinding, real-world failures. Change wasn't just desirable, it felt inevitable. I mean, look at the deadlocks. State legislatures frequently just couldn't agree on a senator. Seats were left vacant for months, sometimes even years. This wasn't rare. It happened, at least 14 times just between 1891 and 1905. So this isn't some abstract theory. This was real governmental inefficiency. It was a failure of basic representation. But honestly, the bigger problem, the more damaging one, was the corruption. It was rampant. Special interests, powerful political machines, they knew exactly who they needed to influence, maybe a few hundred state legislators. And they gained, frankly, overwhelming control. It got so bad that progressive reformers openly called the Senate a millionaire's club, just serving powerful private interests, and the public knew it. High-profile scandals like the 1912 investigation into bribery around Senator William Lorimer's election in Illinois, that just confirmed what everyone suspected and fueled the demand for reform. So that original ideal you mentioned, senators as ambassadors for their states, it was completely undermined by partisanship and, yes, money. I mean, why spend a fortune campaigning to millions of voters when bribery was, frankly, a more efficient use of capital? You could effectively buy a Senate seat for a fraction of the cost. Think about the reported $1 million spent by those two mine owners for just one Montana Senate seat in 1899. It was a known quantity. So the amendment, it was actually really popular, ratified quickly. And, the debate had already shifted towards popular choice way before 1913. The system was already seen as obsolete by the public.
Mm. I certainly acknowledge those documented corruption issues in the late 19th century. They were, yes, quite ugly. But my concern is that we traded those perhaps localized political problems for permanent structural damage to the entire constitutional architecture. And that feels like a very poor bargain in the long run. The core failing, as I see it, of the system we have now is that states have effectively lost any legislative venue to influence directly the course of the federal government. And we see the results today, I think. Look at the pushback against federal actions, for instance, when, 27 states refused to implement key parts of the Affordable Care Act. That massive political opposition from state governments, it had no formal institutional channel in the Senate. Now imagine if senators were still directly accountable to, dependent on, those state legislatures for their jobs. That coalition of 27 states, they would have had real leverage, real power, to potentially block that kind of large-scale federal legislation, or at the very least, shape it much more significantly. Today, the Senate just doesn't seem to fear state capitals.
Right. But I have to push back on that a bit. I'm just not convinced that the vertical check was ever the consistently effective mechanism you're describing. This idea that state legislatures would reliably unify to protect some kind of abstract state interest against Washington, I think that's largely a myth, based more on theory than reality. What the historical studies actually show, when you look at indirect elections, is that partisanship almost completely overwhelmed the notion of state interest. That was the primary driver. State legislators weren't really focused on unfunded mandates day to day. They were fighting tooth and nail over which party, Republican or Democrat, would control that Senate seat. State elections effectively became proxy wars for control in Washington. And think about how this damaged state democracy, too. Making state legislatures choose senators often made those state elections, kind of useless for deciding actual state issues. Voters in Illinois back in 1858, for example, they were forced to weigh huge national issues like the Union and slavery when choosing state legislators, because that election was really about sending Lincoln or Douglas to the Senate. So if we repealed the 17th Amendment today, wouldn't state legislatures just become basically an electoral college for U.S. senators? Wouldn't it just refocus local politics entirely onto national fights and grievances?
Okay, fair point on the state election focus. But let's pivot back to the corruption argument for a moment, because I think there's another angle there. While I agree the 17th Amendment didn't magically eliminate money from politics, that's a much deeper issue. Did it really solve the problem or just change its form? You argue it solved the specific problem of bribing a few hundred state legislators, which, yes, was a discrete issue. But has the amendment actually fulfilled its promise of curbing elite influence overall? Critics today point to the absolutely astronomical sums spent on modern Senate campaigns. We're talking figures like, over $1.1 billion in the 2012 cycle alone? That vastly outpaces anything spent during the indirect era, even if you adjust for inflation. So if the goal was genuinely reducing the influence of wealth, you could argue the reform hasn't just failed, it's actually amplified the scale of money required. Haven't we just traded that localized backroom bribery for a more systemic institutional dependence on massive campaign finance? And doesn't that still result in a Senate that's perhaps primarily responsive to large donors and upper-income constituents? The source of the dependency shifted, maybe, but did the resulting elite responsiveness really change that much?
That's a challenging point about the scale of money today, and it's a valid concern about influence. But I still maintain the nature of the corruption problem changed significantly and for the better in terms of legitimacy. That specific localized bribery of legislators delegitimized the entire institution in the public's eyes. Moving the leverage point from that small, easily swayed group of insiders to the broader public electorate, that was essential for the basic integrity and public trust in the process. That feels like a fundamental gain for democracy, doesn't it?
Perhaps a gain in perceived legitimacy, but at what structural cost? And that brings me back to my core point about eroding the structure.
The original design was, I believe, crucial for making bicameralism work properly. It created a Senate that was deliberately different from the House. One body representing the people, the other representing the states as political and co-equal societies. When the Senate became dependent on the popular vote, like the House, it functionally started to resemble an upper house of representatives, and that fundamentally altered the dynamic of bicameralism. We lost that necessary distinction, that tension between the cooler, more deliberative body and the more reactive, populist one. And what's more, the idea that direct election would somehow reduce toxic partisanship or polarization, well, that just hasn't panned out, has it? If you look at historical data, studies tracking polarization from, say, 1879 onwards show the gap between Democrats and Republicans is arguably just as large now, if not larger than it was under the indirect system. So it feels like we sacrificed that crucial federal check without even getting the promised benefit of greater political moderation.
Well, I think focusing solely on that structural loss maybe overlooks some powerful overriding forces that shape legislative behavior regardless of how senators are elected. There's empirical evidence from political scientists suggesting the switch to direct elections actually had a fairly minimal long-term impact on the substance of legislative work, things like bill sponsorship, committee activity. This suggests that these bigger macro forces, the nationalization of media, rigid party structures, demographic shifts, these tend to dominate electoral outcomes and behavior anyway. And regarding your point on polarization, we shouldn't forget just how partisan the original system could be in practice. Remember, during the indirect era, something like 98% of the winners came from the majority party in the state legislature. So strong party discipline was absolutely the norm back then, too. What did change, I think, beneficially, is accountability. Direct election allows, or at least incentivizes, senators to moderate their voting records somewhat, to appeal to the median voter in their whole state. They aren't just catering to, the specific, sometimes quite narrow faction of the majority party within the state legislature that put them there. It created a more direct link, arguably, between the entire state population and their senator in Washington.
But that link, while you call it democratic, it came directly at the expense of the state government's distinct voice and sovereignty. The Senate's role, I maintain, was never intended to be just a second popular body. Its unique function was to be the institutional voice of the governmental entities, the states themselves in the federal system. By removing that specific mechanism, we essentially allowed the national government to centralize power without facing that formal structural opposition from the states. And I think it's hard to deny that the size and scope of federal power have expanded dramatically since 1913. It seems entirely plausible that removing the Senate's original check contributed significantly to that trend.
And while those consequences for federalism are certainly complex and definitely worth ongoing attention, we can't ignore the functional reality of the old system. It was demonstrably plagued by instability and corruption that were actively delegitimizing the Senate. It was, for all intents and purposes, broken. The 17th Amendment, therefore, felt like a democratic necessity at the time, a response to a system that had clearly failed to live up to the framers' ideals of, wise, virtuous, uncorrupted statesmen. So I think we need to be very cautious about arguments suggesting we return to what was in practice an unworkable past, just for the sake of preserving an idealized constitutional structure that wasn't actually functioning as intended.
The whole history of the 17th Amendment really forces us to constantly evaluate this tension. When we make constitutional changes aimed at enhancing democracy, do they actually achieve their goals? And what are the structural costs? It really boils down to a debate between constitutional architecture and the expression of popular will.
Exactly. And maybe whether we prioritize that structural balance versus basic institutional legitimacy and function. That fundamental tension, well, it remains incredibly relevant and highlights just how complex it is to balance popular choice with institutional checks and balances, especially in modern governance. There's certainly more to explore there.